All right, folks, welcome back from the commercial break. Always excited to have this next guest on. He has his finger on the pulse on things from the budget and the NDAA, where he played a major role with some very important amendments, to the House Intelligence Committee, to just good old common sense in Washington. Joining us right now from the great state of Georgia, Congressman Austin Scott. Congressman, great to have you back on the show.
Hey, John, thanks for having us.
So many things going on today, many of them with deep implications, particularly in Russia. But I want to start with something a little closer to home. Over the last 24 hours, Just the News obtained an email from Miguel Cardona sent out on Education Department email systems to student loan recipients all across the country saying the Supreme Court got the ruling wrong. The Supreme Court literally undercutting the legitimacy of a ruling that struck down the cancellation policy that President Biden had done without congressional approval. Your reaction to think that the Education Department did that and used taxpayers' dollars doing it?
Well, I mean, it's just a lack of respect for our country. And, John, what people don't talk about enough, I think, is the fact that our forefathers didn't necessarily know how to govern as much as they knew that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's why they gave us the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branch of government. Even Speaker Pelosi said that Joe Biden didn't have the authority to do the things that he did with the student loan forgiveness. And now for, Biden to go out and agree to cancel the student loan debt relief, even before the court ruling came out in the debt limit agreement, and to turn around and do this is just proof that there's an intent to mislead from the administration as much as there is a lack of respect for the Supreme Court, because Biden and Secretary Cardona knows this. Biden agreed to terminate the student debt relief program. We believed all along it was unconstitutional, as the Republicans in the legislature. Even Pelosi thought it was unconstitutional. The courts ruled it unconstitutional, and now he turns around and says, well, we're going to try to find a workaround to the courts. And I think just as importantly, John, you just got to understand, the president agreed to do away with the student loan debt relief as part of the debt limit agreement that was passed just a few months ago. So, who do Republicans have to shake hands with? And the answer is nobody. I mean, we can't. People can criticize us for not being able to get to agreements, but once you shake someone's hand and they don't do what they tell you they're going to do,
it's hard to come back to the table, isn't it?
It's hard to come back.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. I haven't heard a lot of people talk about that, but you're right. It really erodes credibility and the trust needed to make the sort of deals to get this country moving forward. You played such an essential role in the NDAA debate, obviously one of the most important pieces of legislation that is passed every year, sets the roadmap for Congress. Ultimately, Republicans got something through, defied the expectations of the news media that was rooting for a loss. Where are we in the process? Are you happy with what came out? And what do you think happens ultimately when the Senate comes back and it's time for a conference agreement?
Yeah, we will. I think the Senate is starting to mark up the bill this week on the Senate side of it. The House bill is over there. I mean, obviously, the two pieces of legislation end up somewhere in between what is a conservative House piece of legislation and what will obviously be a less conservative Senate piece of legislation with Chuck Schumer, putting his hand on the scale over there. We will end up somewhere in between the two, John. The language that we had coming out of committee, and all but one Democrat voted for this language in committee that dealt with a lot of the most abusive diversity, equity, and inclusion junk that you've ever seen that was happening at the DOD. I'm hopeful that remains in. I know some of the stuff that got put in on the floor this past week probably gets removed, but we've got to hold the line on how ridiculous the diversity, equity, and it's really exclusion, not inclusion, John, because they're not interested in diversity of thought. They're interested in people who submit to what they tell them they're supposed to think, and we can't have that. You can't have the best and the brightest willing to go in and serve this country at a fraction of what they can make in the private sector if we're going to tell them what they can and can't think. So we got to get rid of some of this nonsense that's going on in DOD.
Yeah, you hear it from the recruiters. It is a real impact on recruiting downstream and the recruiting officers of America, too. People do not like where the Pentagon has taken ideology in the last few years. Some pretty momentous moments in the Russia-Ukraine war over the weekend. We woke up this morning to news that Russia is canceling the food security agreement that helped vulnerable nations continue to get food through the war zone. How big a moment is this, and what do you think it is that Putin is looking to do with this?
Putin is doing what he always does. He is negotiating on behalf of Vladimir Putin. I thought all along, John, that they wanted to control the port of Odessa more than they wanted anything else, because that would give Putin the ability to hand it over to a couple of oligarchs that could tax every bushel of grain that left that port and turn around and send some of that back to Russia for Vladimir Putin. And so, Ukraine used to export right at 50 million metric tons of corn and wheat and grain a year, 4 million metric tons a month. The ships simply can't go in and out of there if there is not an agreement. And you have to understand, John, the logistics of this, and that somebody owns that ship. They're not going to send that ship into the Black Sea if they can't get that ship insured. No insurance carrier is going to write insurance on that ship if Russia is standing there saying, we're not going to guarantee you clear passage, and you're sending the ship into a war zone. It's literally, not an insurable risk. And so if you own that ship, you're not going to send it in there. And if you're an insurance, and if you're an insurance company, you're not going to write the insurance on the ships to send it in. So we'll see what he tries to negotiate. I mean, I know what he wants is money, and so he's wanting, to be able to ship Russian grains through the Black Sea and put them back out there on the market. But this has got the potential to be devastating for the lower income sections of the world, Africa, Asia, areas where you have a high density of population and not much food supply. And I'll tell you, John, again, it goes back to, and I know I sound like I'm beating a dead horse on this, but the United States has got to take care of its domestic agriculture production. We're dependent on China right now for our seed supply. We were dependent on Russia for our fertilizer supply. These are things that we should have never allowed to happen. And I don't blame the Chinese for being smart. I blame us in this country for not being wise enough to see what was going on and taking care of our domestic food production.
Yeah, it is. That supply chain, we have been asleep at the switch for so long. And now with a much more turbulent world, our vulnerabilities are just sitting in front of us with really clear consequences. Do you think that Congress and the administration understand just how dangerous the supply chain vulnerabilities are? And are you seeing any bipartisan effort to tighten up or improve the situation for the benefit of Americans?
I think most of the members of Congress see it, just like most Americans see it. The problem we have, John, and I'll take vehicles as the example. I mean, they could have done tax credits and other things for hybrid vehicles that would have had a dramatic increase in the miles per gallon that the average vehicle on the road could travel per gallon of gas. And instead of accepting what we know would work and what most Americans would accept, and what is, if you factor in all of the things, a much cleaner source of transportation than these battery-operated vehicles. Look what they did in how they structured their tax credits, that they actually made us more dependent on China, because that's the only people that have the raw materials and can process the raw materials right now for the batteries that are necessary for these vehicles. And if you look at what's happening with, I saw today where Ford Motor Company announced they're dropping the price on an F-150 almost $10,000, even on the base models. The bottom line is people don't want these battery-operated vehicles. We should have gone, we could have and should have encouraged hybrid, but you've got an administration that simply isn't paying attention to the cause and the effect and the outcomes of the legislation that they're passing. They simply want to grandstand and say, look what a good thing we did by demanding that you purchase a battery-operated vehicle effectively, and they're just not being honest about the pollution that's created in both the manufacturing of those vehicles and what do you do with the batteries when they go bad.
Yeah. You create a giant Superfund site across America with this because there's just no strategy for it, right?
Yeah, and look, how do you charge them, right? I mean, in California, they won't let them charge them at certain hours of the day because the grid can't handle them. And there are literally, I mean, in some of these shows, you've got diesel generators that are being brought in to charge the battery-operated vehicle. Well, that kind of defeats the purpose, doesn't it?
Yeah, it literally is mind-boggling. The Democrats' arguments for a green economy often are undercut by the lack of science or the lack of planning, the lack of economics that they've built into their plans. I think most Americans, you see the polling data really moving strongly against an all-EV future, and I think that it seems like people are picking up the vulnerabilities in this plan now. Do you feel like Americans are starting to understand this is not a good national security plan?
I think they are. I think Americans don't understand why we can't build nuclear power plants, which is clean energy. I think they don't understand why there is the attack on natural gas. We could have moved every school bus in this country to natural gas. We could have moved every garbage truck in the country to natural gas. We could have moved every heavy vehicle that starts and stops at the same place to natural gas over the last several years, and you would have had tremendous reductions in the emissions.
Yeah.
But that actually works, just like nuclear power actually works. And it seems like the Democratic Party is they're hung on finding something that doesn't work without huge tax subsidies. And now you're seeing the end results of the failures of this. I mean, if people wanted battery-operated F-150s, Ford Motor Company wouldn't have to cut the price up by $10,000.
That's such a great point. You're exactly right. Last question for you, because I think people have looked through the last couple of weeks and they've seen so many revelations, whether it's the concerns about the U.S. attorney in Delaware not pursuing the most serious case against Hunter Biden, or the Secret Service after 8 days just clapping their hands and saying, we're done with that. We're not going to look any further at the cocaine discovery in the White House. And by the way, never interviewed a single witness in the case. Is there a growing concern in America that law enforcement isn't doing its job anymore, or at least the leadership of law enforcement is not allowing the front lines to do their job anymore?
I think America recognizes that 99.9% of the people that get up in the morning and put on that uniform, that badge, are good and honorable people that are doing their best to take care of us and make our lives better. And that there is a small fraction, a very small fraction, that unfortunately has worked its way into the upper echelons that have tremendous bias. And it is the double standard, John, that the American citizens are not going to accept. And I can only imagine if a Republican president, if cocaine had been found in the White House and there had been a Republican president, there would have been demands for blood tests. There would have been demands for the videos to be released. There would have been all kinds of demands. And candidly, I would expect a Republican president would have called everybody in and said, let me tell you something. You're going to be tested for this. And if you test positive, there's going to be a problem. You're talking about national security, you're talking about the economy, the things that go on inside the White House. You simply can't have people that are doing cocaine. That's all there is to it. And so I feel like if they wanted to find somebody, they may not have gotten to a conviction level of evidence, but I do feel like that they could have, between the FBI and the Secret Service, I think they could have found evidence and narrowed it down to a select few people.
Yeah, and then use a drug test or something else to narrow it even further. Yeah, it's not hard. It's what used to be done.
You have to be drug tested if you want a CDL license. You get drug tested.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, no, right now it's the messages we're sending to young people and also to lawbreakers. Yeah, it is. Congressman, always an honor to have you on the show. I always love when we get at you. You have been such an important voice on food security. I think the country's starting to catch up to just how big a vulnerability this is, but we couldn't have done it without your constant focus on it and all the good things that you've done to bring fixes to the table. So thanks for an update today.
You're welcome. I appreciate you. And we've been lucky so far on this, and maybe cooler heads will prevail and we'll be able to get that food out.
Yeah, that's important. Well, we'll be watching closely. All right, sir. Good to have you on. Thanks so much for spending the time.
Thanks, John.
All right.